2026 is finally here, and with it the municipal elections are fast approaching. Here are my predictions for South Africa's biggest political parties. Happy 2026, everyone. Wishing you all a happy and healthy new year. And while it may be a new year, it's important to remember that politics in South Africa is probably going to come just as thick and fast as it ever has. And this includes the highlight, which is the municipal elections. Now, there is a possibility that the municipal elections could only take place in early 2027, but it seems as if people are expecting it around November of this year. So it's certainly a crucial development to watch. With this in mind, I thought it might be fun for us to make a few election predictions for the major political parties in South Africa. Now, obviously, before we get started, I should give a disclaimer. It's still early in the year, only 2nd of January at the time of recording, and a lot can change. And of course, very important political events could have an impact on political party support. And so a lot of my election predictions could potentially be out of date by the time that the municipal elections arrive. Still, I thought it might be a fun experiment simply because we do have quite a lot of interesting data that came in, both in terms of the by-election results and of course the 2024 general election results. So I thought it might be a fun exercise to do, and it will certainly be fun to compare these results to any future predictions that I or other pundits could perhaps have. Now, of course, if you enjoy this kind of content, please remember to subscribe to the channel for more. It's entirely free, and all you have to do is click on the subscribe button below this video. Now let's get started. So as we get started with our predictions, it makes the most sense to start with the biggest fish in the pond, and that is the ANC. So the ANC seems to be on an inevitable decline. We saw how in 2019 they fell below 60% for the first time in their history at around 57%. And then in the local elections in 2021, they actually fell to 45%. And this is actually the first time that they lost their majority. Of course, 2024's general election was a watershed moment where for the first time ever on the national stage, the ANC lost their majority and were forced into a coalition government. And it seems that when it comes to gauging the ANC's decline, it's not a question of whether or not they'll decline, but rather how much they'll decline by. So before I give you my prediction, I think it's important that we take a few key by-election results into consideration. So the first one I'd like to talk about is Ward 15 in Chris Hani, Eastern Cape. So this was a ward which has historically always been an ANC stronghold. Of course, the Eastern Cape itself is a province which is a stronghold for the ANC. And what happened in this ward is that although the ANC dropped in support, because there was no real viable opposition, they pretty much won the ward outright with no competition in sight. And this has happened in quite a few different rural by-elections, where we've seen the likes of the EFF, MK, PAC, and even the SACP coming into play. But because, well, number one, there's no real alternatives to the ANC ideologically, and number two, these are sort of stereotypical ANC wards, the ANC had little problem fending off these kinds of parties. And so what would happen is that the ANC would drop in percentage and oftentimes lose voters, but they'd still be able to hold on to the ward. Ward 130 in Soweto was a really interesting contest because although the ANC retained the ward, they lost their majority, and it was actually ActionSA who came in second place. We did also see the likes of the EFF and MK also take away ANC votes, but to see a party like ActionSA become the main contender against the ANC shows how the ANC really seems to be losing ideological battles as well as just factional battles. So there does seem to be a large contingency of ANC supporters who are going to ideologically different parties such as ActionSA and even the DA and the PA as well. Finally, we saw Ward 26 in Emalahleni, Mpumalanga, prove to be a massive defeat for the ANC. While it's a traditional ward for them, the DA were actually able to win this ward off of the ANC for the first time ever. And so this again shows how ideologically a lot of people seem to be leaving the ANC as well. Still, while a lot of people are getting very excited about the ANC's decline, I think that a more tempered reading is necessary. And for that reason, I'm going to predict that the ANC will get between 30% and 35% in the municipal elections nationally. The reason I say this is that even though the ANC is declining quite heavily in most places, and it's a pretty inevitable decline, I don't think they're losing enough ground to fall into the 20s. Of course, as I mentioned before, there are still those rural, impoverished strongholds that the ANC seems to be able to hold on to no matter what. And so even though votes are falling over there, it seems that the ANC is still able to pretty much win by default, because even though they're losing voters, no other party seems to be mobilizing voters in those areas. And so for that reason, I do believe the ANC will decline significantly, but just not into the 20s. Maybe by 2029, however, that could finally happen. Moving on to the DA, and I actually found this to be the most difficult party to gauge, and that is for several reasons. So if we look at their key results from 2025, we see a very intriguing trend, which I like to call the great voter replacement, because while a lot of DA voters seem to be departing, a lot of new voters are arriving. So starting in Ward 10 in Sarah Bartman of the Eastern Cape, we saw how the DA have historically underperformed in this ward, and even though they were not actually able to win this by-election, they actually saw their results significantly improve from 2021 and 2024. And this is despite the Patriotic Alliance having a strong presence there, and of course the ANC holding on to retain their seat. Now, Ward 26 in Emalahleni, as we mentioned before, was a watershed moment for the DA, where they won an ANC ward outright. And this is a ward they won for the first time. And it's actually part of a broader trend we're seeing, where there seems to be quite a few voters in certain parts of Gauteng, as well as Mpumalanga and even KZN, who are floating towards the DA from parties such as MK and the ANC. So the DA seems to be penetrating a certain black township and urban periphery vote, which they never had before. In Ward 9, Mossel Bay, the DA suffered a devastating defeat, specifically to the Patriotic Alliance. And this seems to be something that they've seen happen in Parel, in the Cape Winelands district, and certain other areas as well. And so what we see from these three election results is a very difficult picture for the DA to actually decipher, because on one hand, they seem to be losing a lot of colored voters and conservative voters to the PA. On the other hand, we do see how they're still able to stabilize their vote in certain regions despite the threat of the PA. And then you've also got a situation where they seem to be making inroads in black areas as well. And so this makes them a very difficult party to gauge. And for that reason, I actually have to say that I can imagine the DA getting anywhere between 20% and 28% in this election. And now you might be asking yourself, well, that's not a very brave prediction. Why are you giving such a massive range? And the reason I'm giving this range is due to voter turnout. So as we saw in 2024, voter turnout, or rather a low voter turnout, worked in the DA's favor, because although they lost about 115,000 votes in the national election, they actually managed to gain a fair amount of percentage. I think it was about 1 to 1.5%. And the reason for this is because on the national ballot, the ANC and the EFF, so the other existing major parties, lost far more support than the DA did. And so even though the DA lost support, just by managing to weather the storm better than those other parties did, they were able to increase in percentage. And so I think that this could come into play in this election as well. As we've seen, voter turnout has been dropping consistently, both in local elections and national elections. And there just doesn't seem to be any measures right now that indicate that this trend will change. And so it is possible that voter turnout will drop even lower than it was in 2024 and 2021. So in this regard, I think that the DA could actually get towards the high 20s in support. And the reason also why I have to say this is because even though there's a lot of concern for the DA around losing supporters to the PA and even the Freedom Front Plus, we need to remember that these coloured and Afrikaans and other conservative voters are outnumbered by black ANC and former ANC supporters who the DA does seem to make inroads with. So I think that the new incoming voters could outnumber the outgoing voters. Moving on to Umkhonto we Sizwe, and this really was the breakout party in last year's, or rather 2024's general election. Forgot that it's 2026 for a moment. So Umkhonto we Sizwe had a lot of hype surrounding them in 2024, but what we noticed in 2025 is that the party seems to be fast imploding. We saw how leading figures such as Floyd Shivambu and even Duduzile Zuma, who is Jacob Zuma's own daughter, left the party, and it's pretty strongly indicated that this was due to internal scuffles. And so ultimately, it's very difficult to imagine that this party can build on their existing base, especially when they are disorganized and in such internal factionalism, for lack of a better word. So in the 2025 by-elections, we saw that the areas where they were popular in 2024, they remained popular in 2025. And this is indicated by their Ward 17 of Ilembe victory. Now, Ilembe is one of their strongholds in KZN that they took off of the ANC, and they did incredibly well in order to maintain this ward and ultimately win the seat for the first time, because obviously they never existed in the 2021 local elections. But what's really important for us to note with this result is that even though they vastly outperformed the ANC, their percentage and the raw number of MK voters who turned up was lower than in 2024. And this is a trend we've been seeing throughout the year for the MK party. So even in the areas where they are very popular, they seem to be shedding voters all the time. Now, in Ward 109 in Ekurhuleni, we saw how the MK party made massive inroads by taking a very big chunk of the ANC vote. But again, they don't seem to be outperforming their 2024 election result. And so I think that the picture for MK is pretty clear. I predict that the MK party will get between 10% and 12% in the election. And the reason for this is exactly as I explained. I think that they will maintain their existing strongholds, but I think that they are shedding voters. And if other parties are able to mobilize their voters better, this could fare pretty badly for the MK party. Still, I don't see them shedding a massive amount of support because, of course, there aren't really any new parties that seem to be taking MK party members away from that specific party. So, yeah, I think that it will be a moderate decline for them. Coming up next, we have the EFF. So as we saw in the 2019 and even 2024 elections, the EFF seemed to be on a pretty steady decline, and this was actually highlighted in their by-election results in 2025. See, if we take a look at how they did in Ward 37 of Sekhukhune in Limpopo, this is reflective of the national picture for the EFF. So to break it down, Limpopo is the strongest province for the EFF. It really is their heartland, and it's actually one of the few provinces where they do better than the DA. So Ward 37 of Sekhukhune was an ANC ward, but the EFF do see it as a potential stronghold for them in the future. Now, unfortunately for the EFF, they suffered quite a heavy blow there. They lost a lot of support. And although the ANC actually lost a percentage as well as their total number of supporters in this ward, because the EFF did so badly, the ANC were still able to retain their seat. And this has happened in quite a number of wards in Limpopo, as well as nationally. We also saw how certain other parties, such as the SACP and even the MK party and even a party called the Bolsheviks, were able to bite into the EFF support base as well. So I assume that the EFF are only going to go down in the next election. And for that reason, I think they're going to get between 5% and 8%. I don't imagine the EFF losing all of their support, as many people believe they will. But I do think that this is the beginning of the crash for them. Of course, we saw how many people were outraged when Malema decided to excommunicate the likes of Floyd Shivambu and Ndlozi, but I don't think that the fanfare around Malema has completely died down yet. I do believe that the Africa Mayibuye movement under Floyd Shivambu could take some of the EFF support, but we know that he's never been as popular a figure as Malema. And so I don't think that it's going to cannibalize the EFF to a large extent. While Africa Mayibuye might get 1 or 2%, I think that the EFF will largely retain their support base. But of course, we have seen a decline in recent election cycles, and I don't think they're going to turn it around now. Moving on to the IFP. And this is also a pretty interesting party to watch because over the past 3 election cycles, we've actually seen the IFP grow. And this is probably the strongest the IFP has been since 2009, when they were still really riding the wave with Prince Buthelezi at the helm. So the IFP did very well in the 2024 elections, growing both in percentage and support despite the emergence of the MK party. And we saw them manage to retain this momentum in 2025 as well. So the key result for them was actually in December, and that was a victory in Ward 17 of Umfolozi. So Umfolozi is a stronghold of the IFP, and while the MK party did try to gain support there in 2024, they got severely crushed. In fact, the MK party didn't even participate in this by-election. And what we saw in this by-election is the IFP get the most number of voters in this ward that they've ever gotten, absolutely decimating the ANC in the process. Now, of course, this is quite a surprise because by-elections normally expect to have a lower voter turnout than general elections. And so the IFP seem pretty strong here. But what we need to understand about them is that they are a regional party, specifically in KZN and specifically in the northern rural regions. And so I don't imagine that this will translate into an emphatic national result for them. And for that reason, I believe that the IFP are going to get between 3.5% and 6% in the next municipal election nationally. We now move on to the Patriotic Alliance. So I'm pretty confident that the Patriotic Alliance is going to be one of the fastest growing parties in the next election. And we can already see this in motion. So although the party actually had an array of massive victories in 2025's by-elections, there were 2 results that stood out for me. So in Ward 29 of Soweto, Johannesburg, we saw how the PA pretty much came out of nowhere to win the ward off of the ANC. This was in Diepkloof and Noordgesig. And what really happened here is that the PA pretty much mobilized all their colored support, pretty much prying them away from the DA, while also managing to amass a fair amount of black support as well. And for that reason, they would be able to outperform the ANC, ActionSA, EFF, and MK. And so the PA will be very, very happy with this result. Another key result to look out for was in the Western Cape, where they yet again defeated the DA. And this is in Ward 27 in Paarl. So this was a shocking result for the DA because this really happened in their heartland. And the DA, as well as the ANC, seem to have lost votes to the PA in this specific election. And so I think that the PA are in a very strong position, and I would argue probably the strongest position going into the upcoming elections, because not only do they seem to be winning ANC voters, but they also seem to be winning DA voters and voters of other parties as well. And so they really seem to be able to fish in multiple ponds. Still, it is important to note that at this moment in time, the Patriotic Alliance, much like the IFP, seem to be a regional party. Their main areas of operation seem to be the Northern Cape and the Western Cape, as well as the western part of the Eastern Cape and certain parts of Gauteng, specifically Soweto and Joburg South. And so I don't imagine that this will translate into an overwhelming national result for them. However, I do believe that they will enjoy a notable improvement, growing to the range of 4% to 6%. Now, I do think that they are more likely to be more at the 4% level than the 6% level, but either way, it would be a remarkable level of growth for the PA and very encouraging going into the national elections of 2029. We now move on to the Freedom Front Plus. So the Freedom Front Plus didn't have a lot of by-election activity in 2025, and there really weren't any results to note. But the main thing to understand about the FF Plus is that they do seem to be attracting disgruntled DA voters. For quite a while, we've seen how a lot of people have been active on social media and YouTube and other areas complaining about the DA. There seems to be a situation whereby the sort of conservative DA voters who really choose the DA as, if we can call it, the least worst option, are finally giving up on the party, particularly because either they're not happy with the way they're performing in the GNU, or they're not happy with sort of the identity of the party and where they stand politically. So it seems that there could indeed be a push towards the FF+. Now, of course, we need to acknowledge that social media is not the real world, and what we see being amplified on social media might not translate to what actually happens on the ground on election day. Because after all, when somebody appears at the ballot box, they might think to themselves, well, do I vote for a small party that aligns with my values, or do I vote for the DA who does seem to have the proven track record and does seem to have the best chance of beating the ANC and really getting a very strong mandate. And that is something that's going to play out in voters' minds. Still, it is also important to note that social media usage is growing by the day, as are podcasters and YouTube channels and alternative media sources. Whereas, of course, traditional sources such as newspapers and TV channels are on the decline. So it is important to note that although it doesn't always translate to what happens on the ground, these new alternative sources of media are on the rise and their users are growing by the day. And so I do believe that it will have an impact. That being said, I think that Freedom Front Plus could get between 1.8% and 2.8% in the next election. Yes, they may be able to attract certain conservative voters away from the DA, but ultimately they do have a very low ceiling. We know that they generally only appeal mostly to Afrikaans voters and specifically conservatives, and this just isn't a very large population group. The Patriotic Alliance, however, by targeting colored voters, have a much larger existing voter pool to actually pull from. So I do imagine that of the disgruntled DA voters, particularly those who are more conservative, the majority will head to the PA and a minority will head to the Freedom Front Plus. The final party on this list is ActionSA. So as we saw, ActionSA really struggled in the 2024 election, but they have actually shown signs of recovery in 2025. So there were two key results I'd like us to focus on. So in Ward 7, Ramochere Moiloa in the Northwest Province, ActionSA actually made history by winning their first ever ward. Now, this was actually due to a very interesting thing that happened, which is their merger with Forum for Service Delivery. So Forum for Service Delivery had an existing strong support base in the specific ward in Northwest. And so what ActionSA seemed to have been able to do is pull together their support and Forum for Service Delivery support, and of course bring much bigger resources and financing to the table. And this helped to spear this victory on. And it does also seem to be that ActionSA are managing to make inroads not only in Northwest but in Gauteng, particularly within Setswana-speaking areas. And we saw this happen in Ward 109 of Ekurhuleni. So this was a great result for ActionSA because they came from pretty much nowhere in 2021 and 2024 to getting almost a quarter of the vote in this by-election. They only came in second to the ANC, and they came very close to actually unseating the ANC, so they'll be very proud of themselves for this result. Still, Even as they make inroads in Gauteng and Northwest and seem to be recovering back to where they were in 2021, it's important to note that ActionSA's support base really seems to be limited to these areas. We don't see them really making any inroads at all in the other 7 provinces of the country. And so for that reason, I think that ActionSA could recover a little bit, getting towards 1.5%, but I don't imagine them exceeding 2.5% of the vote. At this moment in time, I think that between 1.5% and maybe 2%, if we're a little bit more gracious to them, could be a realistic result. Well, thanks everybody for tuning into my election predictions. I'd love to hear you sound off in the comments and give predictions of your own, and let me know how accurate or inaccurate these results may be. Of course, as the elections come ever closer, I probably will create a few more prediction videos, and so it will definitely be interesting to see how those predictions change over time and how accurate they are when we do finally see the results. As always, if you enjoyed the video, please remember to subscribe to the channel for more content, and I wish you all a happy and prosperous 2026. Until next time, I'm Matthew Cohen, and this is the Power Pod.